someone who was among the youngest ever to hold office from our community and in the state of Vermont. She's running for state senate, and we're very thrilled about her race. There's several others that we'll talk about, and you'll hear from our first endorsee in a second. But of course, at the top of the ticket, we have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, his running mate, Kamala Devi Harris, who we're incredibly proud of. So we'll talk more about these folks in the coming days and weeks leading up to the election. But I'm thrilled to have this fireside chat, we'll say. For those of you who don't know, chaat is a beloved Indian street food. And of course, fireside chats were the conversations that FDR had with the nation in the 20s, in an era where we had there's our former president with some chaat, but it's really important for us to think about impact as bringing our community into the democratic process. So that's how we came up with the name. Shout out to our summer fellow Johnny who came up with it, and we're excited to have a whole series of these. So with that, let me introduce our first guest for the fireside chat, Ronnie Chatterji in North Carolina. He's running for state treasurer. He's currently a tenured professor at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke, and also has a joint position with the Public Policy School there. He is an alumni of the Obama administration, really an incredible candidate who has been endorsed also by President Obama, in addition to impact, another important endorsement on the list there. And we're really thrilled to have him to hear about his insights on the economy and also what it's like running in North Carolina and what his plans are as state treasurer. So thank you so much, Ronnie, for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Neil. And also thank you to Impact for endorsing me and all those other fantastic candidates. 70 Indian Americans running around the country and 24 that you're going to put the full force of the community behind. That is amazing. I'm just humbled to be on the list, and I'm glad to be the first person on your podcast series.
Thank you so much. We're really thrilled to have you. We've heard about you from many people. Many people on our board know you and our organization generally. So it's really exciting to share this with you. I want to start by asking, I think, a basic question, which I think my parents would ask, which is that, you're a tenured professor, really something that's hard to come by these days in academia and anywhere, that kind of job security. And you're running for office to, I think, a 4-year term. Are your parents okay with you doing that and leaving this career that you've built? To walk us through your thinking there.
Well, thank you very much for the question. It was actually the first question that my dad asked me when I told him I wanted to do this. He said, you've worked for the past 14 years as a professor, and before that, 5 years in graduate school to try to get tenure and get to this point and get promoted to full professor and chair professor and all those things. And he said, now you're going to run for office and put that all on hold. But I said, I think the key is, why did I do those things? Why did I get involved in academia in the first place? And it really, I think, is best summarized by the motto of the university I teach at, Duke, which is generating knowledge in the service of society. That's why I became an academic. My theory of change was that if I could write good papers, if I could teach great students, if I could do service in the academy, it would have an impact on the world and the problems I care about, which are a lot of public policy problems we're facing today: climate change, inequality, financial inclusion. And now I see running for office as just an extension of being able to do those kinds of things, but in a different venue. So I want to take what I've learned from academia, bring it into state government. And I think I'll always be a teacher and a professor at heart. So I imagine I'll circle back one day if I'm successful and continue teaching and doing research in some form or fashion. For me, I would take a leave from Duke if I was successful. And after 4 years, we'll figure out where we go from there.
So tell me how, there's a number of things I want to talk about. I want to talk about how your family ended up in North Carolina, your experience as a second generation immigrant Indian American, but also we got to know what the state treasurer's office does. And there's a lot of issues that you just brought up and talked about. And I want to hear how you can address those through that office. But why don't we just start with the beginning, which is, how did you end up in North Carolina? Where did you grow up, and how did your family end up there?
So I grew up in upstate New York, in a small town outside of Binghamton. My parents were both state employees. They immigrated there in the 1960s. And my dad came to the United States in 1961 on a boat the day that John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. And that was really the beginning of our American dream. And my dad and my mom worked for the state of New York, and they were able to put together a fantastic middle-class upbringing for me and my sisters, partly because they had a pension that they could rely on and a state health plan that covered health insurance for everyone in our family. I went on to do my PhD at Berkeley after completing my undergraduate in economics and working a little bit in financial services. After that, the first job I got was at Duke University as an assistant professor. When I came to North Carolina to interview, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. I could have never expected that it would be the place in my life that I would spend the rest of my life. But met my wife, Neely, who also has roots in the area, and now we're here raising our 3 kids. So North Carolina's been home for a decade and a half, and it's going to be home for the long haul. As I tell people in North Carolina on the campaign trail, it just took a little while for me to get here, but I'm here.
That's great. I want to fix your sound for a second, so I'll give you a second to do that. We're really thrilled to have you on, and this is our first Facebook Live. So thank you all for bearing with us. Ronnie,
how do I sound now? Is it coming in better?
That sounds great.
Oh, perfect. All right. Sorry, everyone at home. And Neil, thanks for giving me the heads up. I think we'll have a better conversation this way. Go on and let me know if you continue to have any problems. Sorry about that.
Great. So why don't you just pick up where you left off a little bit in terms of your family, just so we can hear that again.
Sure. I'll start again from the beginning. So I grew up in upstate New York in a small town outside of Binghamton, New York. And my parents were state employees. My dad is a college professor. My mom is a public educator. And they had a pension from the state and healthcare coverage for me and my 2 sisters, which made a huge difference in our lives. It allowed us to have the kind of middle-class upbringing that is the foundation of the American dream. And because my dad was an economist, many of us are tempted to go into the family business, tempted and sometimes nudged and cajoled, I might add, for those watching at home. But I felt like economics was a great thing to study, given that my dad was also an economist. And so I studied economics as an undergraduate at Cornell University, go Big Red, and then worked a little bit in financial services. But having been the son of academics, I really wanted to make sure that I got to the bottom of so many of the different issues we used to talk about at the kitchen table, how the economy worked, how politics and the economy interacted, and what we could do to raise the living standards and develop places across the country using good economic policy. And so I started my PhD at UC Berkeley in the early 2000s, and I finished up in 2006. And in 2006, got the job as an assistant professor at Duke. That was when I really came to North Carolina for the first time. When I came on campus for that interview, I never thought that this would become my home. But my wife, Neely, who is also a Duke grad, we've settled here with our 3 kids, and it's been home for the better part of a decade and a half. And I'm glad to be here and trying to serve North Carolina now that it took me a while to get here, but I'm here. And that's what I tell folks when I travel around the state.
So, you also took leave prior to join the Obama administration. Was that in the first couple of years, or at what point did you do that?
Yeah, so I got involved in the campaign in 2008. I mean, I had been thinking to myself, really, as the man behind the woman, the person making decisions, writing memos, volunteering on campaigns. Something about President Obama's speech in 2004 really spoke to me at the convention. I guess it was now about 16 years ago, since we're living through convention time right now. And if you remember that speech in Boston, one of his classic lines was, "A skinny kid with a funny name can find a place in America." And when he said that, I felt like he was talking about me. I felt like he was talking directly to me. And I never felt that way about a political candidate before. And I surmise so many people listening to this and so many people across the country felt the same way. And so I worked on his campaign, got really involved. And when he was elected in 2008, carrying North Carolina, by the way, I was determined to try to join him at the White House. So he hired me to join him at the Council of Economic Advisors early in the first term. And I joined there as a senior economist. And Neil, it was a transformative experience, both on a personal level to be able to serve a president that you believed in at a really important time, and two, as a professional economist, to be there during the greatest downturn since the Great Recession and trying to think about what tools we could use to get the economy back on track, many of which we're going to need again in 2021.
So tell me more about that. Obviously, we're watching the stock market soar, but unemployment is also doing the same. Can you make sense of that for us? You know, one, I know you're not running for president or at the federal level now. We're going to talk about what happens at the state, but obviously it's a conversation people are having, you know, what President Obama did, you know, what President Trump has done, and kind of what we should be doing as a country. What are your thoughts there now?
Well, first, I think that my perspective as a person running for state government is really focused on the markets, because if I am elected treasurer of North Carolina, one of my primary responsibilities is to be the sole trustee of our $100 billion with a B pension fund. Those are the funds that support people like my parents and other people who work for the state in retirement. Every month, my parents and other people like them put money away from their salary to save. Their employer, in this case, the state government, matches that, and we invest that money in the markets. And when I asked my parents, when I decided to run for treasurer, hey, did you pay a lot of attention to how that money was invested? They said, no, we just assumed someone was taking care of that. And I think a lot of people feel like that about their money in a defined benefit pension plan like what we have in North Carolina. What makes North Carolina so unique is that we have a sole trustee, just one person who makes those decisions on how the assets are allocated, whether we invest in stocks, bonds, real estate, private equity, or other kinds of assets. And so I'm watching these markets and the divergence of the stock market in particular from the rest of the economy, including the job market, with a lot of interest. Because I have a dual role as an investor on behalf of North Carolina. We have elevated unemployment in North Carolina, and that's something that concerns me a great deal. But I also have to be investing the money and understanding where the market's going. Now, why is the market not reflecting the real economy? A couple quick things, since this is not an economics Facebook Live or podcast, but it is something that we'll touch on. One is the stock market drive has really been driven by a few key stocks in technology. Those companies, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, Apple, Google, these companies can be expected to do really well during the pandemic and do well for many, many years to come, which is why the price of those stocks reflects a lot of that value. They may still be overvalued, but there's cases to be made in those technology stocks. But the rest of the economy, thinking about cars, airlines, hotels, they haven't performed as well. And we're losing jobs in a lot of those areas. And I think that this divergence might be telling us that some parts of the economy, a very small part in terms of the number of companies, but a very sizable piece in terms of market value, are really doing well, while a lot of other places and a lot of other regions are not doing well. Think about the companies I just named, Neil. Most of them are located in California or on the West Coast near Seattle. Think about all the other places in America and what the job markets look like today. Think about all the places that are dependent on locally provided services, retail, and restaurants. Think about all those districts, those candidates that you mentioned on the first slide are running in. These places are still hurting. And so I think that the stock market does not represent the economy. As an investor, I definitely have to understand how it works, but I'm also going to have to make a concerted effort to understand that most people in North Carolina aren't going to have much money, if anything, invest in the stock market. And most people in North Carolina are going to work in service industries that are affected by this great pause that we have with COVID-19. And so I think that they're going different directions. The market may eventually come back down to earth, but in the meantime, we have to do everything we can to help people who are out of work and who are vulnerable right now.
I can feel why people would vote for you. And someone has said they will, especially now because of how important it is to have someone who just understands what is going on. And so, you know, I think this is another reason we're thrilled to endorse you, because clearly you're so knowledgeable on what's happening with the economy. And that's, I think, what people are most concerned about now, which is, you know, and always, which is their jobs and their opportunity. Can you tell me a bit about that? So I think that obviously is a central issue, the economy, but kind of what else are you hearing when you campaign? And also we could talk about how you campaign and how you're reaching voters and figuring out what's important to them and what you are running on.
Sure. I mean, in the primary, Neil, we ran what looks like a more conventional campaign in terms of a ground game compared to what you can do now. I traveled all around North Carolina in my car, sometimes with my campaign team, sometimes with on my own, and just met with folks all across this state. We're a large state with 100 counties. We're very diverse across the eastern part of North Carolina, the western part, the Triangle, the Triad, the Charlotte area, and everywhere else. So we really encounter very different kinds of issues depending on where you go in North Carolina. There was an article in the Washington Post 2 days ago pointing out that North Carolina is like a microcosm of America. Our urban areas are growing and in many cases becoming bluer, though not always. And our rural areas are having much more trouble in terms of economic growth, and they're becoming redder in some places in North Carolina. What's interesting is we've elected Democrats and Republicans all across North Carolina for a long time. This is a state that elected Terry Sanford, a progressive Democrat who was the namesake of the school at Duke that I teach at. We've also elected people like Jesse Helms, who are on the conservative side. So North Carolina has been an interesting place to campaign. I've learned a lot. People talk mostly about the economy when I speak to them because they think that the treasurer ought to know something about the economy, and they're right. But there's a second piece because the treasurer also manages the state employee health plan. Remember, I talked about my folks. Their health plan covered me and my two sisters. Well, that health plan in some states is run by the Department of Health and Human Services. In North Carolina, it's run by the state treasurer. So I would be the largest payer, if elected, of healthcare services in North Carolina across all 100 counties, covering 700,000 people. It's like running an insurance plan with 700,000 members. And so I'd say when I got on the campaign trail and started talking about healthcare, the most common thing I would hear is we need access to affordable healthcare and we need Medicaid expansion in North Carolina. What surprised me, Neil, the most is that people with insurance are very nervous about losing it and very nervous about its coverage, as much as those who don't have insurance at all. And that was probably something I heard on the campaign trail before the March 3rd primary more than anything else. Now we're on Zoom. I can talk about that more, but that was up to the primary what we heard the most.
And you must have been there, I think, in the Obama administration when the Affordable Care Act passed. Is that right?
That's right. I came right as the bill was passed and was part of the group that had to think about implementing it and think about its effect on small businesses, on health systems. And so that's when I came in 2010.
And I know it's still taken so much time to reach the point where we have every state covered and buying in. And can you say more about what you can do in North Carolina to expand coverage and access?
Sure. I mean, Neil, Missouri just became the 38th state to expand Medicaid. Ruby red Missouri, much redder state than North Carolina in terms of its politics. And they voted by ballot referendum and it passed. And this is telling you that Medicaid expansion is something that's popular across the country. 38 states have gone in to expand Medicaid. Now, I tell folks I'm a big sports fan, so I don't like North Carolina to be 39th in anything. I want to be first in as many things as I can be, but we ought to be 39th at least now, and we ought to get Medicaid expansion. And it's going to take an act from the General Assembly with a lot of nudging from our statewide leaders, people like the governor, Roy Cooper, people like me, if I'm elected, our next state treasurer. So I'm hoping that we can expand Medicaid in 2021. We should have done it 10 years ago. It makes economic, social, and moral sense, and it will keep our people healthier and inject new money into the economy. We haven't done it for a variety of reasons, but I'm pretty optimistic with this 2020 election that we're going to get it done.
Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned climate change. Can you tell me what the Treasurer's Office can do on such a global, seemingly intractable issue?
Yeah, so I wrote a book 2 years ago called Can Business Save the Earth? And the topic of that book was really focused on what different stakeholders can do around climate change. So if you think about climate change, there's a really important role that investors play in climate change. I mean, after all, companies are responsible for a lion's share of our emissions in the United States and around the world, and companies have investors. Now, who invests in companies? Well, it turns out there's a lot of big asset managers like the Vanguards, Fidelities, and State Streets. But another big group of investors are public pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS, the New York Common Fund, and yes, the North Carolina Retirement System. When you have $100 billion in investments, you got 100 billion votes on the way the economy operates and who it works for. And I intend to think about that power in a strategic way. For me, when we're an investor in a company and someone who's read and done a ton of research on this, I want to understand what their climate and sustainability strategy is. I might sponsor shareholder resolutions. I may work with management. I may get together with other public pension funds to make sure that our investments are protected. To me, Neil, it's not a political issue. I don't want my folks' money being invested in companies that are going to have stranded assets in 20 years because they weren't looking around the corner to think about climate change. I don't want my folks' money being lost to regulatory fines and penalties to executives who are short-sighted rather than thinking about the long term. That's the job of long-term investors like public pension fund, and it's a job I intend to fill as our state treasurer. So you can have a huge impact on climate change and a bunch of other business policy issues if you're a sole trustee of a pension, the way I would be if I was elected.
Yeah, I think that's a really incredible example of why local government matters, even on these big picture national, international issues, because to address climate change, it's not going to be enough to, well, one, obviously not rely on the federal government right now in terms of President Trump pulling out of international treaties, but there are levers to pull, and as you've said, the Treasurer's Office can use its powers as an investor through shareholder engagement and other activities to actually push the private sector in a better direction. And I'm excited to read your book. Can you plug it again? What was the title?
It's called "Can Business Save the Earth?" and it was written in 2018. But in general, if you want to learn more about my ideas on this, you can always go to RonnieChatterji.com as well. We've talked about this issue and talked about it in a lot of interviews. Neil, I really agree with you that state and local, I mean, to quote my favorite play, Hamilton, this is the room where it happens. State and local government. State and local government is where we need to have more people running for office. And that's, again, where I want to thank Impact for reaching down and not just endorsing our fantastic federal candidates, but also endorsing state and local candidates. To me, any theory of change begins with the state and local. And if our interest is getting more Indian Americans involved in the political process, my gosh, look at our example of Kamala Harris. She was a district attorney at the local level. She was an attorney general at the state level. And only then did she run for United States Senate at the federal level, and now is going to be our next vice president. That's a career of somebody who was not an overnight success story, but somebody who did public service at all levels and really understands the way government works. I think it's a great example for a lot of us to follow.
I think that's a great place to pause or to end this as a basic introduction to you. And I'm excited to send this to our nationwide list so people get to see kind of what a star you are in North Carolina. And I know we have many folks. I was on the phone with somebody from North Carolina this morning who's just excited to see members of our community really step up and take a role in public leadership. And one thing I just want to ask, and you're mentioning your own book, but somebody had asked the question, kind of who are your guiding lights? Like who inspires you, whether it's books or individuals who are in public life? If you can just give us some examples of that.
Sure. For me, I think my inspiration really started at home with my parents. I mean, my parents, just like so many of our folks, they just put an emphasis on our education and doing the very best we could. For my parents, education wasn't a means to an end. It was an end in of itself, to learn more about the world and become a critical thinker. And I never, ever can repay them for instilling that in me, because it's helped me in every aspect of my life. I also see them as risk takers. A lot of people think about, oh, you're a professor running for office, you're taking this big risk. And I think a lot of us in the second generation feel like this. My parents took one of the biggest risks a person can take when they were far younger than me. My dad getting on a boat when he was 20 years old. My mom marrying a guy she barely knew to come to a country she'd never been to. That's risk, right? And I know Neil's shaking his head because it's probably similar to your history and so many others.
My parents are watching this, so I can give them a acknowledgement that they absolutely did take that very same risk.
And so uncle and auntie, if you're listening, right, it's like that's a risk. And so I feel they gave me the privilege to be able to do the things I do today. I think about it even with the current election. Y'all remember when Trump came down to Greenville, North Carolina, and they had that rally where they were saying, send them back, send them back, send them back. They were talking about people like me and my kids, right? People like you, Neil, people like all of us. And my parents, during their generation, they had to worry about raising us, paying the mortgage. They had to keep their heads down in a lot of ways. But because they did that and gave us a solid foundation, because they took those risks and built a solid life, people like you and I, we can stick our necks out. We can run for public service. We can run organizations like the one you're running, and we can try to make a difference. And so in terms of inspiration, my parents are the folks who I have to give all the credit in the world to. In terms of political leaders, I will always have a soft spot for President Obama. He's the one who gave me a chance in politics. He's the one that inspired me. But I'm pretty darn excited about Vice President Biden, who I also worked with in the White House. I remember when I first met him, he said, "Ronnie, if I had your hair, I'd be president." And I guess he didn't need my hair. He's still going to be president. But excited about Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris. I mean, amazing, right? And building in that tradition where the identity she's built as a candidate, as a public servant, as a person is just phenomenal. I never will forget that line at the convention a couple of days ago, last week. She said, "My mother raised me to be a strong Black woman, but she also raised us to be proud of our Indian heritage." And my gosh, I mean, can you think of any other country in the world where that sentence would have made sense? Any other country in the world where that sentence would have made sense for someone running to be the second most powerful person in the world? I can't think of one. And that's why I think the American dream is still alive. And I think our community's got to keep getting involved.
Thank you so much for being here and to being such an inspiration to so many people. I'm excited to share this. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, the dream is alive, and we've got to keep it alive by staying engaged and having a say in the direction of our country. And it's inspiring to see you step up and do that.
Thank you.
So let me just.
You've been watching Impact's Fireside Chat with Ronnie Chatterji. We use the occasion to announce our endorsements in this year's elections. More than 20 races, of course, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, President and Vice President of the United States. And we're talking with Ronnie Chatterji, candidate for North Carolina Treasurer. Ronnie has several events coming up in the next several weeks that I'm sure he'd like to tell us about.
Sure.
Ronnie, please.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to tell you about some of these events. And again, thanks for the opportunity. One of the great things about this race, even running at the state level, is we've gotten a lot of support from people all around the country. I think it's because if we're elected, we would make history as the first Asian American ever elected statewide in North Carolina history. And that's drawn a lot of attention for everyone from President Obama, who's endorsed us, to Senator Cory Booker, who we're going to be doing an event with on September 9th, to Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who we have an event come up with on September 8th, and also Jake Sullivan, who had been the policy director for Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, advised Vice President Biden when he was vice president, and now is a campaign advisor on the Biden campaign. So we'll be working with Jake first on September 1st. For those of you who are interested in how North Carolina is going to be a key swing state and how having an Asian American person on the ballot statewide could drive turnout, please join me and Jake. We'll talk about the intersection between the federal and the state level. For my North Carolina peeps on the call, you know North Carolina is the ultimate swingiest state, and what happens here in the Tar Heel state is going to have a huge impact on the election. On September 8th, with Vivek Murthy, we'll be talking about the impact of COVID on public health. One of the big things being state treasurer, if I'm elected, is I will be the person paying the bills for most of the healthcare in North Carolina. And I want to think about the impact of COVID-19 on our elective surgeries, on our ED volume, and our hospital finances. In North Carolina, a large percentage of our rural hospitals have negative margins. Providers all across North Carolina are facing shortfalls. And the question is going to be, for someone running a 700,000 member plan, how can we be a better partner in this state and make sure that rural healthcare and urban healthcare and everything in between is provided? And Vivek is an inspirational speaker, as many people know who are watching. Really proud to have his endorsement and his support. And the last event I think I'll tell you about, September 16th, I'll be joined by Ambassador Richard Varma, our first Indian American to be an ambassador in India. We're excited about that one on September 16th. Please join us. We'll talk about U.S.-India relations. We'll also talk about the international investment climate. As an investor, I think a lot about this and how we think about the Indian and Chinese markets, given Ambassador Varma's great experience. So those are some events coming up, and would love you to join. Hey, Neil.
Thank you for covering for me while the Wi-Fi cut out. Appreciate it.
Zoom world, man. It happens all the time. I'm sitting here with a headset, so what can you do, right? But we're entrepreneurial, if nothing else, right?
Yeah, definitely. We're working out the kinks. Well, I hope I get to meet you in person sometime, and maybe in the treasurer's office. So thank you for all you're doing and to serving as an inspiration. You clearly have so many people who are stepping up for you from our organization, and folks like Ambassador Varma and Dr. Murthy, who are really leaders, in their professions. And it's just thrilling to see how well you're doing now, and very excited to see you take office.
Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone. You can reach out to me on Twitter or at ronniechatterji.com. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. We'll end it there. And if you want to get involved with Impact, we're going to have more of these conversations. We have a Zoom briefing with actually Senator Jay Chaudhry, who could be the next majority leader in North Carolina. We will have that on Thursday at 7. If you want to sign up, just go to our website or email events@iaimpact.org. We also have another great event coming up, South Asian Women in Leadership, Ushering a New Wave of Diversity in the Biden-Harris Era. That's co-sponsored with South Asians for Biden. It's going to be hosted or moderated by Minnie Timuraju of our board on Impact. And it's going to have 4 great candidates, including Dr. Nina Ahmad here in Pennsylvania, Kesha Ram in Vermont, who are 2 of our endorsees this cycle, and also 2 candidates who are currently in office. So please join us for that. It's also going to be on our website. Sign up for our email list if you haven't already. Just go to iaimpact.org. On the bottom of the front page, you can give us your email, and we'll keep you posted on future events. So again, here are our 2020 endorsements. If there's someone in your state that you're excited about supporting, please reach out, and we'll keep you posted on what we are doing and how we're supporting them through grassroots organization or other events. Thank you for joining us, and we'll keep you posted on future events, and appreciate everyone who helped us work through the kinks of our first Facebook Live, but it sounds like we had a great audience, and we're excited to share this. Thank you, everybody.